Very first part of our marine invertebrates unit, we're going to be focusing on the phylum Porifera, which is our sea sponges. And these are our organisms that are organized at the most simple level, at that cellular level. So as we're going through this, there are two different ways that you can do this set of notes for this week. All right, so you can, and you should have already done this on page 47 in your notebook. You should have already copied down this marine invertebrates organizer. As we are going through the set of notes for the phylum Porifera, which is your very first line, you can fill them in as we're going through the notes and then go back in and actually rewrite your notes in your notebook. Or you can kind of copy the notes as we go through the video and then fill in this chart at the end. So up to you how you want to do that, but both the chart and the notes do need to go into your notebook. So check that table of contents to see which page those are going on. All right, without further ado, let's talk about SpongeBob. So SpongeBob himself is a completely fictional character. He looks like a common household sponge, but in reality, he actually has a few scientific accuracies to him. So we're going to kind of visit some of these different characteristics of sea sponges, and you can kind of, in your own head, start thinking about SpongeBob and all these different episodes. If you did watch that growing up, I still watch it sometimes. My husband's a huge fan. So it might be kind of fun to revisit some SpongeBob. Do a little throwback while you're at home. All right, so the first thing you should have done is actually viewed the Bill Nye video on marine invertebrates, and it had some questions that went along with that, and you should have answered those in your notebook. So let's talk about this very first phylum of invertebrates. So if we remember back to the video before this, so last week's video, that marine invertebrates, or invertebrates as a whole, account for 97% of all animal species on Earth. So these marine invertebrates are organisms that don't have a backbone. They tend to be a little bit more simpler in regards to organization levels. So remember we talked about organization of organisms being starting at the cells, the smallest unit of life. Cells build tissues, tissues build organs, organs build organ systems, and then all the way up to an organism itself. All right, so a little bit of general information about sponges is that one, they're organized at the cellular level. So technically in a perfect world, we could take our sea sponge, got myself a little sea sponge right here. All right, we could take our sea sponge, we could throw it into this cellular blender, blend it all up into little tiny cells themselves. They could all recongregate back into a sponge. Okay, so these sponges are organized only at the cellular level. They just have different types of cells all working together in order to basically help this organism to live. And this is the weirdest part. These are animals. Okay, so sponges are animals. They belong in the animal kingdom. And it's weird to think about that because this is actually an art sponge. It is a sea sponge, a natural sea sponge that you can buy from the art store. And this is how people get the little, weird prints on all their walls and stuff like that. They're also used for cleaning. So here's a sponge again. This looks a little more yellow like SpongeBob himself. Then we also have different types of sea sponges that look a little more marine-like in their appearance. All right, so sea sponges themselves, and I went over this in the video last week, are asymmetrical organisms. So here's my lovely piece of a sea sponge. All right, and if you notice, this thing cannot be divided into any type of symmetry. So these phylum Porifera are characterized by being asymmetrical. They are also organized at the cellular level. And these adult sponges are sessile. So remember back I said that one of the characteristics of being an animal is that it's mobile at some point. Well, the only time that a sea sponge is actually mobile or able to move is when it's in the planktonic larva stage. So when it's a little itty bitty single cellular tiny little cell sponge, that is the only time they're actually moving through the water. They then adhere to a surface, what is referred to as a substrate. So these sponges adhere to a substrate and they become sessile, meaning that they do not move. And those are two terms that are going to go hand in hand, but they're going to be confusing if you don't get those right in your head. So think a substrate is something that it attaches to. Sessile means it does not move. Okay. All right. And sponges are really cool in that they are actually filter feeders. So they suck in all of this suspended organic matter in the water and they filter it through their pores. And they actually get their name porifera by being pore bearing. All right, so we can see here we've got lots and lots of little holes in our sponges. We've got pores on top, we've got pores on the side. All right, so this phylum Porifera just means pore bearing. All right, so let's look at our sponges real quick because I'm actually going to have you draw this diagram as well in your notebook and label them out, okay? So the very first thing that we're gonna talk about with a sponge is something referred to as the ostia. And I'm trying to find my sponge that has the best example of that. It would probably be this one, right? These ostia are the little tiny pores where the water is going to come into the sponge. And we're going to find these all along basically the outside of the sponge. That's what gives its porosity appearance, its porous appearance. All right, so we've got all these little holes on the outside of the sponge, and that's where the water's coming in. However, when the water comes in, the water has to go out somewhere, so it's going out the osculum. And these osculum are these big giant holes. If we look at a tube sponge, it's got holes all on the sides, and then the osculum is that big hole at the top, okay? So the water's coming in through the ostia, it's leaving through the osculum, and what's crazy is that inside of the sponge, you definitely can't see because they are so incredibly tiny, is that they have something called a choanocyte. And a choanocyte is basically just a collar cell. It lines the entire chamber of the sponge itself, and that's what's filtering out this food. All right, so all these little organic debris, these organic particles are coming in through the ostia. Sorry, my hands are blue, I've been tie-dyeing. All right, so they come in through the ostia, all right? It's filtered out by these choanocytes, these little tiny collar cells. They have sticky linings to them, and that food gets trapped, and then the excess water is pushed back out the top. All right, so if we're looking at our diagram here, no, this is not a pineapple, it is a sponge. All right, and this is the diagram you'll see the most often for this. All right, our osculum is at the top, our ostia are on the sides, so we're seeing that water coming in here. It's being trapped by these little collar cells, so all of these little sticky flagella-like particles are trapping all that organic matter and then filtering out that water back out the osculum. All right, there are two other things that were labeled in this diagram, and it's a spicule and an amoebocyte. And these are kind of secondary terms. They aren't super important. I focus more on the ostia, the osculum, and the choanocytes because that's how sponges are actually surviving and actually feeding. All right, so these spicules, though, are actually siliceous. So remember we talked about silica. It's that little, the kind of glass-like substance that comes in the shoe packets when you buy a new pair of shoes. All right, so it can be siliceous or calcareous, meaning it's got that calcium carbonate base to support an actual sponge. So if you look at a sponge, yes, I can crumple it up, but yes, it comes back together. So these spicules are what are giving it its shape. It's almost kind of like a skeleton, but sponges don't actually have a true skeleton themselves. And then amoebocytes are the cells that actually produce the spicules. So spicules are what are giving it kind of its shape. Amoebocytes are what are producing those spicules. And this is what they look like. So they look almost like little ninja stars, and they basically line the entire body of the sponge, and that's what gives it its form and its shape. So either siliceous or calcareous for those particular organisms. All right, and then the very last thing we're going to talk about with sponges is that there are different types of reproduction. So they are animals. They reproduce sexually and asexually, which is kind of cool. All right, so basically, sponges go through that broadcast spawning, if you really think about it. However, they are internally fertilized. So they release tons and tons of gametes into the water. The male sponge will release sperm into the water, and then the females will actually pull it in through the ostia and go through internal fertilization. And many sponges are actually hermaphrodites. So depending on the location, depending on what the need for the gametes is, that's when they will determine what gametes are actually being released into the water column in order to be fertilized. So they can switch kind of back and forth in there. And the sperm is made in those choanocytes as well. So those choanocytes are not only trapping the food, but they're also producing the gametes needed for sexual reproduction. All right, I did mention that larva was the only motile stage, so the only time they're actually moving around is when they are tiny little larvas. All right, and then sponges are actually going through asexual reproduction as well, which if you remember, just means that they just need one pair. I'm trying to find my best sponge down here. All right, so let me use this little guy again. And it's a prime example because we've got a sponge that is actually budding off of another sponge. All right, so they grow an identical organism to itself out the side, genetically identical, and that is how they are reproducing, so sexually and asexually.